the long hall of Varnhelm drank the night like a mouth. Ribs of black stone arced overhead, carved with the names of kings who had not slept for centuries. Lanterns swung from chains like pale moons and threw halos across faces powdered and jeweled, across shoulders stitched in silver and fur. Outside, the city lay under a slow breath of fog, an obsidian map of towers and roofs that gleamed with the faint suggestion of something older than law. Inside, the Feast of Crimson Crowns was in full, ritualistic bloom. They arrived like constellations made flesh. Princesses from border duchies and inland, marches moved beneath the vaulted ceiling with the practiced grace of those who had been taught to be ornaments first and people second. Their gowns made noise like sealed seashells. Their trinkets chimed when they turned. Each bore, at the center of her chest or hidden in the folds of her sleeve, a single clear phial tipped with congealed shimmer, ancestral blood, signatures of dynasties, vows distilled into glass. The court had always believed that sacrifice was tidy if it came wrapped in lineage. At the high end of the hall sat the vampire king, King Calith, his throne a jagged crescent of onyx and bone that seemed grown rather than made. He wore the night like a coat, a dark that swallowed edges. His eyes were the color of old silver, harsh and reflective, and they tracked the procession of vials with the appetite of a man who had been awake since the world first learned the word hunger. For 100 years men had whispered that his immortality was their bargain. In exchange for the king's protection, the noble houses brought their daughters. For 100 years peace lay in the damp palm of that exchange. But peace, like all bargains, was a question with teeth. Calith's hands rested on the arms of his throne, thin and pale as if he had been carved from winter. He did not lift his goblet when the first of the princesses came forward and offered her blood. He watched instead with the clinical patience of one who had learned to wait for pattern, until a drop of crimson met air and did what the court had been taught blood would do. It darkened, shimmered, and pooled into acceptance. The court exhaled into relief like a congregation at the final hymn. The ritual continued, pageant upon pageant of lineage, until their offerings stacked like a small, glinting forest of glass. Behind the rows of silk and braid, beneath the muraled eaves where the servants kept to shadows and the smell of stew, Mara Edivane moved with the sureness of habit. Her hands were scarred with dishwater and work, her apron tied in a knot at the small of her waist. She had round shoulders and the plain skin of someone who breakfasts under lamplight and carries coal indoors before she goes to bed. She was not part of the feast. She had no place in its promises. She served wine, caught plates, wiped the condensation from the carafes with a cloth that had seen better decades. The nobles ignored her by design. The world ran smoother when maids and waiters were unseen. Mara had come to the castle that night because she could not do anything else. Her brother's cough had eaten through coin and sleep, and the ledger of debts did not accept prayers. She moved through faces like a whisper, balancing a tray of flat ale and a chipped cup, steps practiced to the tune of survival. When she passed beneath the waxed chandeliers, her sleeve brushed a tablecloth. The ale slopped, a thin arc of brown that landed at the edge of the high-throned dais. No one cried scandal. No one noticed the small, accidental spill, except Calith. His gaze slid from the stream of noble blood to the streak of common ale as if the two belonged in the same sentence. For a breath, the hall felt like a held thing, a caged breath. Calith's eyes, those old, silver wells, found the tray in her hands, traced the thin scars at her knuckles, lingered on the stubborn way she lifted her chin when a guard's boot nudged her aside. Something in him uncoiled, ancient and surprised. It was not hunger the court had known for generations. It was recognition, as abrupt and as private as a bell struck for a single, solitary name. It was a look that did not belong on the face of a king. Around the long table, the assembled nobles shifted. Conversations thinned to whispers. Lady Viral, draped in wolf-gray fur and the cold smile of a house with no spare mercy, leaned into her neighbor and breathed the first question. Why would the king look at a servant as if he'd found salvation? The rumor spread like spilled oil. 100 questions chased it. How could a sovereign choose a maid? What did such an eye owe to the hierarchy of crowns? Yet the court that had long mastered the art of performance could not turn away from the rawness of that gaze. For all their careful pedigrees, the princesses were suddenly as vulnerable as any unmarked throat. Caliph rose as if he had been shaken awake from a long, precise dream. When he moved, the torchlight seemed to draw away from him in small lines, revealing the skeletal architecture of his throne in harsh relief. "Bring her," he commanded, not loudly so much as inevitably, as if his voice were simply the next thing set down in a ledger the world had been keeping without complaint. A guard reached for Mara, because kings gave orders and lords obeyed. She braced with a steadiness that surprised herself. She had learned not to glow with the panic that wanted to pull the breath from her. She set the tray on a nearby ledge, its chipped rim catching a shard of light like a mouth with a cracked tooth. Faces watched, and in the watching the hall narrowed to the space between her and the throne. As she stepped forward, the air around Caliph seemed to thicken. On the stones beneath their feet, the carved names of ancient kings looked down like accusing witnesses. They had fed a hunger for generations. They had accepted a single kind of remedy. But in the hush of the hall, the old prophecy, taught in curt, whispered breaths to children by bedside lamplight, seemed to stir its thin wings. Not crowns, not titles. Only the blood that runs untitled shall break what binds the night. When Caliph's hand rose, the movement was small and lightning quick. He did not reach for a goblet. He reached for recognition. His fingers hovered, then folded as if closing around the memory of a name he had not spoken in 1,000 years. Mara did not know prophecy. She knew the names of herbs and how to find warmth in a draught. She did not have lessons in salvation or lineage. All she brought forward that night was a battered tray, a patched dress, and a life stitched together of necessity. Yet the decree of centuries pivoted on the narrowness of her shoulders. Around them, the feast of crimson crowns continued to sing its ancient hymns. Yet somewhere under the stone and the ritual, fate had shifted, and the world had taken notice. The dawn never truly reached the lower halls of Castle Varnhelm. It lingered at the edges of the world above, a faint gray smear over parapets and towers. But here, beneath the kitchens and the tavern's sweating walls, the air belonged to shadows, heat, and the slow drip of condensation. Mara Edivane had long since made peace with that kind of half-darkness. It was her sun, her roof, her entire horizon. She moved through the tavern with practiced stillness, balancing a tray of ale mugs with the precision of someone who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. The clatter of voices, dice, and the occasional brawl drowned out most thought, which suited her well enough. It was easier to serve the world when no one remembered your face. Above her, the castle stretched upward like a cathedral of bones, its upper halls home to silken courtiers, and beyond them, the crimson court, where King Caliph sat on his throne of dusk. Few below ever saw him. Fewer still dared speak his name aloud. For centuries, he had been their guardian and their dread, the immortal king who drank blood not for pleasure, but for balance. His court believed that his hunger kept the other monsters at bay. That belief, like all convenient faith, demanded a price from those too poor to resist paying it. Mara wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve, listening to the muffled strains of music echoing down from above, the remnants of the feast of crimson crowns that had ended hours ago. She had glimpsed the processional from afar, carrying jugs of wine for nobles who hadn't looked at her once. But she had felt it, the moment the king's gaze had met hers. Even now, she tried to dismiss the memory, but it lingered like a bruise she could not see. A feeling, not a thought. Something old and cold pressing against the edges of her chest, whispering in a language her dreams had only ever half understood. Her brother, Theo, lay in their narrow cot behind the tavern kitchen. His cough was deep now, edged with the rattle that came before fever. Mara crushed herbs in a wooden bowl, the air thick with the scent of mint and iron. "You should rest," she said softly, setting a damp cloth against his forehead. Theo tried to smile but only wheezed. "You work too much, Mara. The tavern will eat you alive." "It already has," she said, with a faint smirk that almost hid her worry. He chuckled weakly, then closed his eyes, sinking into a fitful sleep. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, each breath a prayer she dared not voice. Outside, a bell tolled 6, the hour when the castle's shadows shifted, when night began its slow surrender to morning. And yet, for Mara, It was always night. That evening, the tavern brimmed with guards and courtiers, some celebrating, some gambling away their wages. The feast had ended, but gossip lived longer than ceremony. "Did you hear?" whispered one of the scullery maids near the counter. "The king spoke during the feast, to a servant." Mara's hand stilled. "A servant," another scoffed. "Ridiculous. He hasn't uttered a mortal's name in 100 years. "No," the first insisted. "One of the servers from the kitchens. The king ordered her to be brought forward. And they say he looked at her like she was the first sunrise he'd seen in an age." Mara turned away before they noticed her pale face, gripping the tray until her knuckles ached. Her heart stuttered as if the air itself had remembered her name. The rest of the night blurred. The laughter of drunken guards, the ring of coin on wood, the heavy stink of spilt ale. Mara moved like a ghost through it all. It wasn't until the last guest staggered out that she noticed the goblet, black silver, its rim etched with the mark of the king, left behind on one of the long tables. She frowned. The king's chalice. How had it found its way down here? She lifted it gingerly, careful not to smudge the crest. Her reflection warped in the metal, a tired woman with shadows under her eyes, hair unpinned, hands roughened by work. Then the cut. A tiny slip of the finger against the jagged edge of the goblet. Just enough for one bead of blood to rise and fall, landing inside the chalice with a muted sound. The liquid shimmered. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the blood flared black gold, curling like smoke and swallowing the faint torchlight. Mara gasped and dropped the cup, but it didn't fall. It hovered, trembling in the air like a living thing. The torches along the wall flickered out. The tavern went silent, unnaturally silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the footsteps. They echoed down the stairs before she even saw him, soft, deliberate, ancient in rhythm. Guards flanked him, but their torches didn't flicker. They bent toward him, flames leaning like supplicants. King Calith. He was taller than she remembered, his presence a gravity that pulled at the edges of her being. His silver eyes glowed faintly in the half-dark as he stopped before her, looking down at the floating chalice, then at her bleeding hand. "Who spilled this blood?" His voice was low, the kind that could turn mercy into an execution. The guard stepped forward instantly, seizing Mara by the arms. "Sire, it was the maid. We saw." Calith raised a hand. The guards froze mid-motion. "Do not touch her." His tone didn't rise, yet the air obeyed him. The chalice stilled, then descended slowly into his palm. The black gold light inside it pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat. Calith's gaze met hers. "Your name," he said. Mara Edivane." He tilted his head slightly, studying her face as though searching for something long buried. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did, a faint tremor that made the floor seem alive. "You are from the lower wards?" "Yes, my lord. You have family. My brother, he's ill." A pause, his eyes softened barely, then hardened again. "You will come to the palace at dawn." She blinked. "My lord, as servant or prisoner, the difference depends on how the night treats my temper," he said, her breath caught. "Why?" Calith glanced at the chalice. "Because your blood has remembered something the world has forgotten." He turned, the guards moving aside with wordless deference. And just like that, he was gone, leaving the tavern dim and hollow, the air still shimmering faintly with gold where the chalice had been. Mara stood frozen, her pulse wild beneath her skin. Her cut had already closed, leaving no scar, no trace, except for the faint hum in her veins, a rhythm that didn't feel entirely her own. Later that night, as she tried to sleep beside her brother, her dreams came like fire through glass, vivid, ancient, and impossible. She saw a monastery on fire, a woman cloaked in silver chanting over a cradle, blood pooling into symbols on the floor. She heard the cry of an infant, neither human nor vampire, and a voice whispering, "When the untitled bleeds, the crown shall break." She awoke with a scream that caught in her throat. The room smelled of iron. Her palm throbbed though there was no wound. Outside, dawn clawed its way up the horizon. And in the highest tower of Varnhelm, the vampire king sat alone, turning a black gold chalice in his hand. The faint echo of her heartbeat still ringing through the metal. The palace above the tavern was a geography of windows and whispered rules. Marble corridors drank the torchlight and gave it back colder. Portraits of kings, half-finished and painted in the hush before memory, lined the walls. Their painted eyes tracked newcomers with the bored malice of those who had been remembered too often. For Mara, who had always known the underlight of kitchens and the honest smell of boiling broth, the palace felt like a body that refused to breathe. She arrived at dawn under the escort of 2 guards who kept their spears at respectful length. The servants' quarters given to her were small and smelled faintly of lavender and old ink. A narrow bed, a single shuttered window, a stool. It was more than she had in the lower wards, and she told herself that this was fortune. But fortune in Varnhelm had teeth and always wanted something in return. The court, to its credit, was efficient at pretending nothing had changed. The princesses who had come with their vials of blood kept their distance, their smiles lacquered. The ladies' maids dropped curtsies that were edged with coiling calculation. Even the cooks, her old companions, looked at her with a mixture of awe and pity and suspicion, as if proximity to the throne might smudge them with contagion. She learned rules quickly: never speak unless spoken to, never sit where a lady might need to sit, carry messages in pairs when possible, keep your hands visible, and above all, do not draw attention. Drawing attention, however, had been the least of her worries this week. Caliph watched her. He watched with a stillness that was almost scientific, an attention that catalogued rather than consumed, as though he were making an inventory of what she was and what she had been. Sometimes she would catch the flash of his profile in a downlit corridor, see the narrow slope of his shoulder outlined against a tapestry of wolves. Once, she found him in the library, standing before a shelf of books Thar smelled of dust and rain, his fingers tracing spines as if reading Braille. He did not smile. He did not speak. He merely observed, as if trying to fit the rawness of her into the orders of his long memory. It made the other courtiers restless. Whispers gathered like moths. Lady Viral, whose house had prided itself on producing heirs who never needed an education beyond a mirror, glided through drawing rooms with a knife smile and the practiced patience of a predator. She took to passing Mara in the hall with a sniff that suggested the tavern odor would not be washed off with any tide. "Servants," she said once, loud enough for a circle of ladies to hear, "are charming precisely because they are invisible." Her laugh was soft and practiced, as brittle as the tassels on her sleeves. Mara learned the palette of small humiliations. A cup would be withheld until the princess had finished speaking. A chair would shift as she approached. A maid would accidentally let a rumor leak that Mara had been found whispering to the storeroom herbs. Witchcraft, some said. Luck, others scoffed. The court took its amusements as a rite, but Caliph treated none of it as entertainment. He regarded each unfolding slight with the cool attention of a man who had watched empires fold like paper. Then, in his private moments, he would call for Mara. Not as punishment, not as parade, for questions that wandered dangerously toward intimacy. Their conversations began in the margins of the day. She brought him boiled quinces and bread when he ate alone. He received her with a nod that suggested the arrangement was contractual. Yet the questions that followed were not of recipes or the quality of loaves. They were of memory. "You dream often?" he asked once, fingers blackened by the coal of some other thought. Mara hesitated. Dreams had been hers since childhood, fractured glimpses that came like rain in summer, shocking and sudden. She wanted to say yes and then to say no. "Sometimes," she answered finally. "They come in the night." He was stern when he probed, but not cruel. "Describe them." She told him about the woman in silver, the sound of chanting, the infant's cry. She did not speak of the hunger that buzzed through her veins since the chalice. There were some things, she sensed, that fed on words. When he listened, there was a curiosity that softened the angles of his face. He was not, she realized, unknowable so much as complicated. A man who had learned to keep his hands clean because touching anything would be dangerous. On the third night, when the moon was a pale coin over the courtyard, Caliph told her the truth of his curse. They sat in a narrow gallery that opened onto the inner gardens. Frost had raked the leaves into stiff patterns. He held a small, black gold cup in his calloused hands and watched the light bend in it as if each angle could reveal a calculation. "I was not always a monster," he said. The confession did not bleed from him like a confession from a sinner. It was more like an admission of fact. Long ago, before the pact and before the thrones of bone were set, I kept watch for this kingdom. I defended it against what prowled the borders. In time, what I defended became the thing I could not leave. A bargain was struck, blood for safety. Mara kept her posture. And the bargain? It is precise, he said. I can drink mortal blood of those who give themselves freely to me and feel nothing. It passes through me like water through woven cloth. It fills me with warmth for a day. It leaves me unchanged. But there is another kind, blood that does not consent. That blood carries the weight of unwillingness, of fear, of stolen life. That blood, when I take it, pulls the tether that holds the curse in place. It binds and breaks simultaneously. The words came without flourish. Mara's hands tightened in her lap. The image of the chalice in the tavern, the black gold shimmer that had bent the torches out of obedience, stood sharp in her mind. "So you hunt unwilling blood?" she asked, the accusation in her voice less polite than she meant it to be. He looked at her with something like pity. "Hunt is a term the court would accept. It is more precise to say the curse seeks what it needs. I do not choose what afflicts me. I choose how I answer it. And what will happen if—" Her throat closed around 1,000 small questions she did not have the right to ask openly. He turned the cup in his hands. "If the untitled blood is offered, there are stories. Some say it kills me outright, others that it frees me. Some stories say both. But the old myths are poetry blown thin by time. All I know is that certain bloods sing to the curse in a way others do not." There was a silence then. A sparrow landed on the garden wall and looked at them both as if deciding which of their faces to trust. Mara, despite herself, bristled. "So you command people like livestock. Bring them, and you will see whether you are free." Calith's mouth twitched in something that could have been a smile if it did not erode at the corners. "I have been commanded by bargains longer than your house has had a hearth. I have seen men offer their daughters like rent. I have listened to priests call it mercy. I am tired." She heard exhaustion in the confession, and to her own surprise, it touched something protective inside her. The king was not a simple cruelty piping its demands. He was a man entrapped by law and myth, trying to comprehend the shape of his own need. That realization did not make it easier to be in his power. Rumors swelled. Glass in frames trembled when she walked by. Mirrors cracked slowly, spidering outward until servants spoke of a jinx that followed her. One morning, while she brushed her hair by a tall silver mirror in the antechamber, the pain chilled under her palm and then fissured in a web that did not cut her. The other maids scattered, whispering of curses and of bad luck, and some crossed themselves. Mara pressed her palms to the glass until the cold burned, feeling beneath her skin the faint glow of something like runes, like script written in a language that pulsed rather than read. When Calith entered the antechamber that day, he paused, hand on the painted sill. He did not comment about the broken mirror. Instead, he asked in a softer voice, "Can you feel it?" "Feel what?" she asked, because she could not say runes without being laughed at or worse, confined. "The marks beneath your skin." He stepped closer until she could see the slow rhythm of his breath. "Do they sing when I am near?" Mara's face warmed. "Sometimes, at night, when I dream." He nodded slowly. "Eldrick will see you." Sir Eldrick was the palace scholar, gaunt, spectacled, and given to the mannerisms of those who have stared at books until their faces look like folded maps. He lived in a tower full of scrolls and kept candle stumps that smelled of sweet resin. When Mara was brought before him, he regarded her hands and sighed as if something old and sorrowful had been set before him. "You are an oddity," he said, not unkind. He ran a long, pale finger over the back of her hand, where she swore the runes had glowed the night before. "Not a witch, not in any honest definition." He smiled, which made the crowd of scholars present feel as if the air had shifted. "There is a lineage, old as the monastery ruins beyond the northern pass. They were called the Eclipsed Line. Their daughters served at night, and their sons took vows in secret. That house, our histories say, vanished in a single winter." He paused, flipping a brittle page like a man consulting a ghost. "Some texts suggest their blood, untitled, unclaimed, was woven into a protection for the realm. Others imply they made enemies that did not forget." Mara's mouth went dry. "You mean me?" Eldrick shrugged. It is a possibility. The bloodline has been declared in most records extinct, but history does not have a monopoly on truth. It has only the version that those with pens prefer. He peered at her. If your blood is of that line, you are more dangerous than a tavern maid and more precious than a princess. Danger and worth wired together like two sides of a coin. Mara felt both at once. Not everyone welcomed the revelation. Lady Viral's smile became an arabesque of venom. She marshaled her allies, not to protect the court, but to exploit it. If she has ties to that line, she hissed in a private parlor, then she is an instrument. Instruments are played. Instruments break. Her fingers, decorated in several rings, tapped against the arm of her chair. We will not have the throne upend itself for some kitchen girl. If the king is so easily swayed, then perhaps he should be tested. What Lady Viral meant by tested was not the gentle scrutiny of etiquette and rumor. It was the kind of probing that turned humans into offerings and pity into spectacle. She whispered to a captain of the guard who owed her a favor. She bribed a keeper of lists. She arranged for a servant, faithful to her house, to discover a priest who remembered the old rites, one who would say in the right place and tone that the untitled blood must be proven. Mara moved through the palace with the sensation that invisible hands were reading her like a map. Eyes followed her. Scented candles trailed smoke in the shape of question marks. Even so, she found herself, in the quiet hours, returning to the garden gallery where Caliph sometimes waited. There was a simplicity in those moments, two people alone with a sea of history separating them. He spoke not as a king then, but as a man who had learned the language of regret. "Why me?" she asked once, finally, the words sharp as flint. His reply was quieter than she expected. "Because you are not a princess. Because your fear is not gilded. Because you do not know how to lie about your want. I thought once that power would make me immune to longing. It did not. It hungers still, for what is honest and unglossed." He rubbed his thumb along the rim of the cup he always carried when in company. "You are not his choice. You are the fault line." She looked at him then and saw, for the first time, not the polished edges of a ruler, but the bruise of a man who had bled in private and kept his wounds for show. It made her pulse with pity and a fierce, protective irritation that surprised even her. "If they make me a sacrifice," she said, voice small, "I will not go like a lamb." He studied her, the lines of his face unreadable for a long breath. "I do not want you hurt," he admitted. "But I will not promise you immunity, I will promise you effort." That was a promise tenuous as glass, but it was something. For Mara, who had never expected to be cherished, an effort was an unprecedented luxury. At night, she would sometimes wake to the echo of Calith's footfalls in the hall. Once, she found him standing in her doorway, a shadow within a shadow. "You are restless," he said. "So are you," she replied, more blunt than she intended. He inclined his head. "I am learning how to be mortal with a curse tethered to my throat. It is not graceful." Mara rolled onto her side and watched him. "Then learn something good," she muttered, "like how to make bread without burning it." He gave, finally, something like a smile. It did not reach his eyes, but it warmed the room the way a single candle might. "I will try." Outside the palace, seeds of unrest took root. Lady Viral's whispers turned to plans, men who owed her recalled favors. Sir Eldrick dug deeper through brittle accounts and maps. The court divided into those who saw a future where the king could be freed, and those who saw a future where any attempt to alter such a bargain would burn the kingdom down. Mara moved between them all like a thread pulled through the eye of a needle, not yet knowing whether she would hold the fabric together or make it tear. And every time Caliph watched her, it was with a study that bordered on worship. It unsettled her. How easily his attention could turn a shadow into something edged with warmth. She resented that warmth and clung to it in equal measure, as if it were a cloak to keep out the court's chill. The palace had drawn her in, a moth to an impossible flame. She did not yet know whether she would find herself burned, or whether the fire might, at last, teach the kingdom to breathe again. The dreams became a drumbeat. Steady, increasing, impossible to ignore. They came without warning, tearing the nights into ragged fragments. Mara woke with her mouth full of ash and the taste of copper, palms damp though no fever had come. In the first dream she stood before a monastery that burned like a living thing. its bell tower bent like a bone, flames licking and finding the carved faces of saints. Faces in the smoke turned toward her, eyes like coal, lips moving in a language she could almost name but never quite caught. In the center of the courtyard, a woman in silver knelt over an infant swaddled in red. The child's cry was not wholly human, and not wholly animal. Above them, the sky had split in a bruise of color. The sun swaddled in shadow, a slow eclipse that painted everything in a red the world had no name for. Each time Mara woke, the memory of that cradle sang through her veins. She would press her hand to her chest and feel, beneath the thud of her own heartbeat, a secondary pulse, faint, ancient like the echo of someone else's drum. She tried to tell herself the dreams were merely stress. The strain of tending Theo, the weight of sudden court life, the unslept nights. But dreams, she was beginning to understand, were rarely kind liars. They gnawed at the edges of waking truth until the two could no longer be told apart. Caliph noticed. He noticed the way she blinked in the light of morning, how her fingers trembled when she poured his tea, how she started when a page slammed. He began to take her into parts of the palace few servants ever saw, corridors lined with tapestries that smelled of moths and starch, rooms where the light lay in patterns like trapped insects. He did not command. He beckoned with a hand that had held counsels and swords and now, uncertainly, offered company. One dusk, he led her to a wing of the palace she had only heard of in whispers, the Hall of Glass. The corridor that opened into it felt colder than the rest of the castle, as if frost had been kept there by design. Frost that did not melt under the breath of a man. Heavy glass cases lined the chamber, each containing a painted portrait. They were arranged like a family tree turned into a gallery. Kings and queens, daughters and sons, faces that stared back with the stubborn certainty of those who had been memorialized. Each portrait bore a date and an etched name. Titles of houses long folded into history, the years they gave to the bargain. Caliph moved between the frames with a reverence that looked almost like ritual. He held Mara's hand lightly, ruling the space between them with a gentleness she had not known him capable of. "We keep them here so the bargains do not get lonely," he said without irony. "So history does not forget what was traded." She traced a finger over a glass that showed a young woman, pale, hair coiled, expression vacant, labeled. Princess Eleanor of Maris, gifted in the 5th year of the moon. Mara had seen that face in the chalices, in the hush that followed. Each portrait carried the soft collapse of someone who had been given to peace. They came to a frame set apart, smaller than the rest, as if someone had tried to hide it by modesty rather than guilt. The painting showed a woman who startled Mara with the ease of recognition. The tilt of the jaw, the shape of the mouth, a mole near the left temple. The painted eyes were not a perfect match, but threaded through the canvas like an echo. Below the portrait, tiny script had been etched into the glass. Anwen of the Lantern House, Keeper of Night, year of the last eclipse. Mara touched the name and felt a cold run up her arm as though the letters themselves were thin veins pulling frost through her skin. The pulse under her palm thrummed an answer, not her pulse, but something older. Caliph watched her without speaking. The silence between them grew thick, full of unspoken histories. "You know this woman?" she asked finally. His fingers tightened around hers, not in command but in steadiness. "I have read her name in records and in prayer songs. There are fragments we do not speak aloud." He paused, as if choosing which relic of truth to unbox. She was a priestess, Mara, one who kept watch in the choirs at night when the world was raw and closer to its edges. Mara's knees threatened to wobble. "She looks like me." "You look like a version of her that has been softened by years and hunger," Caliph said. "And that is not a cruelty. It is a truth." He set his chin and met her eyes with an intensity that made her feel both naked and strangely seen. "There are prayers that speak of an eclipsed line, a family of guardians who answered the night with candles and codes. They were said to be untitled. No house claimed them, no castle kept them. The court forgot them because forgetting is easier than guilt." The Hall of Glass hummed with that same faint pulse Mara felt in the marrow of her bones. She imagined the monastery flames from her dreams, turning portraits into ash, names into smoke, histories into the breath of a world that would not remain still. In the days that followed, Sir Eldrick dug, and his digging turned into a slow, methodical excavation of story. He came to see Mara with folded maps and brittle pages, an excitement in his voice that made him seem less like the scholar and more like a child who had found something forbidden in an attic. "This is not mere coincidence," he said one afternoon, spreading a map across a table. He tapped at a point north of the city where the scribes had drawn symbols that matched the runes she had felt beneath her skin. There were rites performed once along that pass. The lantern house, Anwin's place, was thought to hold wards. These were not household wards. They were old as the mountain roots. He looked up, spectacles slipping down. "If you bear that blood, Mara, you are both the key and the lock." "Do you mean I?" She could not finish. The thought of being both bane and blessing was like standing on the lip of a cliff and being told to choose which step to take. "You were not named to any great house," Eldrick said. "That is precisely why the prophecy clings to possibility. Untitled blood does not carry the weight of vows or the comforts of name. It is raw and unbound. It answers to things that the crowned fear." The enormity of the revelation settled on her like a cloister veil. Her hands moved, automatic, to smooth her skirts. She looked at Calith, who had been listening in a shadowed doorway. For a moment he appeared smaller than she had imagined, the palace's carved teeth no longer lending him monstrous scale. "Why would it be me?" she whispered, not sure whether she wanted the answer. "Because the current of fate prefers the path of least expectation," Calith said quietly. "Because the world sometimes folds in on itself and spits out the person least ready to become pivotal." Pivotal. The word had never been used for her before. It had only been used for the women who wed into houses with names that tasted like brandy and winter. She felt sick at the idea of being the axis on which a kingdom turned. The more Eldrick discovered, the more the court rearranged itself. Some fretted with the righteous horror of those who had discovered their kings had feet of clay. Others, like Lady Viral, began to whisper of expediency. If Mara's blood could free Calith, what a prize that would be to hold in one's fist. The political calculus of bargain and favor sharpened around her like knives. Then, one night, in the half-light of a chamber that smelled of lavender and old books, Calith did what no portrait and no record could have prepared him for. He told her the truth of his hand in the old slaughter. He did not speak with the cold detachment of a historian. He spoke like a man making confession at the edge of a grave. "Once, when anger wore the face of certainty, I led men to a lantern house," he said. "We believed they harbored abominations. I thought I was erasing a threat. I thought I was protecting the realm. I was wrong." Mara's stomach dropped into an animal hollow. "You killed them." "It was not simple," he interrupted. "The night was confused. We had lost soldiers. Fear had teeth. I listened to counsel I should have ignored. They—" His hands clenched around a goblet until his knuckles blanched. "We burned a place that should have been spared. Names became ash. If there was blame to be laid at my feet, it is heavy." He bowed his head, a motion that seemed to cleave the room clean of light. The admission, raw and unadorned, landed in Mara's chest like an unexpected stone. She felt the old dream of the burning monastery strike in the hollow behind her ribs. The woman in silver, the infant, the bell tower bending, threads snagged in the confession he offered. "You don't know," she said, voice small and jagged. "You don't know what it means to have your people erased. You don't know how the world keeps the memory of fire under its tongue." He looked up at her then, eyes luminous in the gloom. "I know my guilt," he said simply. "I have lived with it. For centuries I have thought perhaps the thing that would end me would be what I had done. Perhaps vengeance would be the medicine for the wound I made, or perhaps redemption." Mara wanted to hate him in that moment, hate for the fires, the lost names, but hatred felt too easy, too clean. Instead, she felt a complicated cocktail of grief and a fierce, bewildered pity. This man had the blood of kings and the weight of slaughter pooled under his nails. He had been a monster to some and a savior to others. Now, in confession, he was only a man who had kept his shame like a relic. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the question both intimate and political. Calith rose and walked to the window where the first hints of dawn threaded like pale stitches across the sky. He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was almost a whisper. "I want to understand you. I want to know if there is a way the curse can be unmade without draining you of your life. I want to do better than I did when my hands were eager to burn. And he turned, and in that movement the palace, the portraits, the centuries seemed to tilt. I want to be forgiven if forgiveness is possible. Forgiveness. The word resounded with an impossible weight. Mara felt it like a hand pressed to her sternum. What did one woman, untitled, hungry for ordinary peace, owe to a man who had carried guilt for ages? What did she herself want? She could leave. That thought flared like a small, stubborn flame. She could slip into the lower wards with Theo, find a life stitched with small mercies and cheap bread. She could avoid the court's knives and decide that destiny was not a thing she would entertain. And yet when she looked at Caliph, with his confession like a wound spread open, she felt a thread she could not yet name. It tugged her toward him in a way that frightened her. Love had not been part of her calculation until that moment. It felt dangerously like a furnace, something that would either warm or consume. "Stay," he said, as if he had heard the map of her indecision. "Not because I have some right to command you, but because I would prefer your company to be a choice." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "If you choose to leave, I will not stop you." She wanted to test him then, to see whether his hands trembled when he promised. She stepped forward, and for the first time, let the nearness speak for them both. Her fingers brushed his sleeve. His breath hitched. The space between them shrank until their faces were close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corner of his eyes, the map of a life that had been long for living and poorly tended. They leaned in, the world contracting to the soft gasp between a heartbeat and a sigh. Mara thought of Theo's cough, of the monastery at fire, of the portraits in glass, of the stewardings of history that had made her into an instrument. She thought about choosing to stay or choosing to flee. She thought of the taste of copper and the echo of an infant's cry. Their lips were almost there, an answer poised on the brink. Then, from somewhere beyond the palace walls, the air itself shivered with sound. A horn, long and terrible, its note a blade that cut through the quiet. It was answered by another horn, and another, rising like a chorus of cold iron. Windows rattled, dogs howled. Servants ran in the corridors, sending up shocked cries. Caliph straightened instantly, the spell between them snapping into pieces that hummed like broken glass. He went still, his face folding into the mask of command. "North," he said, the single word a verdict. "The northern armies breach the pass. They come with banners that bear old grudges." Mara's heart slammed against her ribs. The almost kiss vanished like breath on a winter window. The room filled with the scent of lavender and the metallic tang of fear. Outside, far across the walls, smoke unfurled like black petals. History, it seemed, was impatient. The choice she had been asked to make waited for another night. For now, the kingdom demanded attention of a different kind. Battle, blood, the clatter of things that could not be bargained away. She watched Caliph move, swift, decisive, the king born out of 1,000 prior decisions. The man who had confessed to burning a lantern house now bared himself to war. In the crack of that horn, Mara understood that destiny did not pause for intimacy, nor did it soften for confession. It demanded resolve. As the castle bloomed with activity and the hallways filled with the shouts of men preparing to meet steel, Mara pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth to still the noise that rose within her. Somewhere under the roar of mobilization, the faint pulse she had felt from the hall of glass thrummed like a drum. The dreams, for a moment, quieted, not ended, only held like a breath before a plunge. The choice would come again. For now, there was war on the horizon, and with it, the very real possibility that blood would be shed in ways neither prophecy nor pity had foreseen. When the horns began, they did not come alone. They arrived with the feel of old things waking. Banners unfurled like black wounds, riders rattled over the cobbles, and the sky itself, a dull pewter over Varnhelm, seemed to brace. The northern host was not a single army, but a coalition. Beneath their colors rode men who still remembered ancient slights and vampire lords who smelled opportunity in every scared heartbeat. Caliph had expected enemies of flesh and steel. He had not expected the reckoning of the creatures who prowled the fringes of his bargain. The first assault came at dawn. It began as a probing, arrows that sang with poison tips, scouts that tested the outer gates, but it did not stop. Word spread like spilled oil. Rival vampire houses had thrown their lot into the fray. Lords who had been content to lurk in shadow now stepped forward, teeth bared not just for plunder but for throne. Calith's name, once a seal of uneasy peace, had become a challenge. If he was weakened, if the throne showed the hint of fracture, others would rush in to claim what centuries had kept. The castle erupted into movement. Men shouted orders that smelled of old wars. The blue of banners became streaks as soldiers clambered ramparts and burned oil. The court's politics, once a slow-moving sculpture, turned into a living thing that lashed out with claws. Lady Viral's smile hardened into armor. Her plans, refined by whispers and interests, snapped into execution. Mara watched from the battlements as the first dark shapes rode across the plain. Her stomach was a rolling thing of cold. Beside her, soldiers muttered strategies in clipped phrases she only half understood. Theo's face pressed in the memory behind her eyes, his cough, the small scraped hands from chores, and Mara felt the weight of a world that had always asked more of her than it had given. Then the betrayal that had been crouched in the court's shadows leapt. Lady Viral had never been content to let fate decide. She shaped it with the hands of the ambitious. When the castle's defenses needed mouths and limbs, she supplied men who answered to her, not to Calith. In the confusion of smoke and clamor, she slipped through the lesser corridors with a small troop whose orders were simple. Take Mara, verify her blood, and present it as a gift that would make the king eternally beholden to Viral's house. They found her in the service wing, where the scent of boiling cabbage still clung to the air. She had been carrying a pail of water when the captain's men sprang their net. One moment she was a woman who moved through life more by habit than hope. The next she was hauled into a cart, blindfolded, hands bound with cord that smelled faintly of lavender. The cart jolted and then rolled away, the fortress shrinking behind a curtain of smoke. Mara's heart beat in the rhythm of the fight she had not chosen. She tried to wrench free, to bite or plead, to do anything that might make them hesitate, but the cord bit through skin, and the men's faces were hard with the sort of loyalty that owed more to coin than conscience. Her voice scraped for help, and the walls sent back only the distant groan of steel and the whistle of an arrow. They brought her before a small, private altar in the keep, one of Lady Viral's secret rooms, where candles guttered in glass and a bowl of wine waited like a false welcome. Viral stood before her, all the poised cruelty of a woman who had learned to fold charity into leverage. Behind her, men with knives and cloaks of rank shifted like dark plants. Do you see what you have done? Viral's voice was made of silk and glass. You have become the lever by which the world will change. Your blood will settle what centuries have argued. She smiled, and the smile was a promise of many small deaths. Come now, offer yourself, and perhaps the king will owe more than gratitude. Perhaps he will owe everything. Mara's hands trembled. She tasted iron when she thought of the chalice and of the way Calith's eyes had looked when he confessed to his past. She thought of Theo and the crust of bread she had wrapped in the pockets of her apron. She thought of Sir Eldric's voice, key and lock, and the way his spectacles had slid down the bridge of his nose when the map of history had turned up strange. She thought of the hall of glass and the woman with the mole on her temple. You'll not make me a gift, she said, voice cracking but fierce. I am no one's pawn, Viral laughed softly. We'll see. She signaled, and a man stepped forward with a blade. It was thin and purpose-made for excision. Not a weapon of war, but of ritual. We will test whether your blood frees him. If it does, your death will buy us favor. If it does not, well, you will be punished for your presumption. They bound her to the altar, the ropes pulling her arms up so that her wrists strained. A hood obscured her vision. The man's blade whispered against the leather strap around her wrist. Mara felt small and ordinary in a way that was brittle and sharp. News, violent, fragmentary, reached the throne. Calith, in the midst of rallying his regiments, felt a fracture in the air, the way a man feels the first crack in an old bone. Something in the court's web had moved against his knowledge. He tasted the shift like the metallic tang of blood on his tongue. Then came the message, delivered like a slap. Mara had been taken. He did not hesitate. Whatever the politics, whatever the history, Mara's kidnapping turned the calculus into a single equation. Find her, save her. His command was absolute, not because he desired to command, but because urgency left no room for debate. He moved through the palace like a man who had shed 1,000 layers to become a blade. The guards called him sovereign, but Caliph moved beyond titles. He shed the human pretense of negotiation, something old and terrible in him, coiled in the place where curse met need, unraveled. He called to the night, not as a figure of law, but as a storm made flesh. On the battlefield beyond the walls, he became an elemental. The air thickened around him, and men said later that it was as if the dawn itself had been cut from the sky and reshaped. Shadows bowed to him. The earth answered with a low moan. He did not simply gather his retainers. He drew the line between predator and prey in a way that made soldiers on both sides quiet their talk. Vampires who had come to covet his crown felt the pull of an old power and hesitated. He strode across the churned earth with the long-legged stride of a thing that was no longer content to walk politely through its centuries. Where his boots struck the soil, grass turned black and then green again in a bloom of unnatural vigor. He raised his hands, and the night obeyed, a storm of crimson rain that fell only where he willed. It was not literal blood. It was a weather conjured by a hunger that had learned to mimic elements. Red leaf-fall, ash, and the scent of iron that made men flinch back. In that crimson storm, the enemy's lines disintegrated as if time itself had been made to wobble. The vampire lords who sought his throne recoiled. Some burned under a light that was not sun and could not be survived by their particular tether. Others, more cunning, melted into smoke and fled, their desires for the crown shrieking as they vanished into the trees. The battlefield became a crucible of shifting allegiances and sudden terroirs. For a spell, Caliph's power made law, but power, even wild and red, is not omniscient. While he drove through the host, breaking lines and bending fate's course needle, he did not see the small room where Lady Viral and her conspirators had bound Mara. She was a shard in a constellation of danger he had yet to map entirely. Inside Viral's chamber, the hood had been tugged from Mara's head. The man with the blade's hand shook, whether from fear, sympathy, or the weather beyond the windows, it was hard to say. Viral smiled and stepped forward with ceremonial gravity. "Be brave," she said, voice thin with triumph. "Offer yourself and free the king." Mara felt her pulse in her throat. She refused to flinch as the blade touched her skin. Pain is a precise thing. It returns the body to itself. The cut was shallow, just beneath the wrist. It beaded, and she thought, oddly, of the first time she had bled as a child and the hush that had come over the household. The blood looked ordinary, red and bright, until Viral lifted the bowl and set it beneath. Mara had not expected bravery to be an option, yet in that instant the world narrowed until there was only choice. She remembered Theo's cough, the smell of boiled herbs, the nights she had spent imagining a life where doors did not close at her back. She remembered Anwen of the Lantern House, the painted face in the hall of glass. And she remembered Caliph's confession, his hands clenched on a goblet, his vow that he would do better. She thought of the prophecy, its thin voice in children's songs. Not crowns, not titles, only the blood that runs untitled shall break what binds the night. Mara did not want to be the kind of woman whose bravery came with a martyr's price. She wanted the slow mercy of years with Theo, the ordinary dignity of cobbled streets and bread warm in the morning. But there was another hunger rising within her, an understanding that some sacrifices were not thefts but choices. She lifted her chin. "If my blood will free him," she said, voice clear as metal at the edge of a forge, "then I will give it willingly, not as your pawn but as my own hand." Viral's face fell into something like confusion. Her conspirators muttered. Rituals prefer offerings taken. Mercy offered is slippery and discomfiting. Yet the blade was already poised. Mara reached beneath the altar with her free hand and drew something folded there. A scrap of linen with the faint embroidery of a lantern, Anwen's sign. It had been smuggled by Sir Eldric's acolyte, who, though loyal to Lady Viral in payment, had a conscience purchased at a cheaper rate. Mara pressed the cloth over her wound, then smiled at Viral without warmth. "Do what you must," she said. The man tilted his head and drained the bowl. He tasted the blood and paused as if struck by an unexpected note. His face contorted into an expression that hung between awe and panic. The room swayed as if the floor had found a new center of gravity. Outside, where Caliph had been throwing the tide of battle like a cloak over the battlefield, the crimson storm changed its cadence. It tightened, drew a breath, and then unraveled. Something ancient in the air, coiled, patient, hungry, suddenly screamed in a sound too old to be carried by wind. Caliph felt it like a puncture through decades of sleep. It had the taste of closure. He did not understand at once. Power, when it is an old thing, can be stubborn to receive its own ending. Then the world shifted. The storm collapsed into itself. The night's bond, its law of demand, came undone like a seam pulled free. The vampire lords who had been reeling under his command lost their pall of fear. Men in the field staggered, as if a fever had passed through them. Caliph's knees buckled. He staggered, caught on the pommel of a fallen standard. For a breath he did not move. The centuries that had leaned against him fell away like the shedding of a coat. Light, bright and unfamiliar, washed his sight. He felt something cold and new, and then the warm press of life flooded his limbs in a way that made him drop to his knees. Back in Viral's chamber, the man who had drained the blood, his face white as the linen Mara had given, gasped and then vomited. The bowl clattered. Viral's composure cracked like glass. Mara's strength evaporated in a rush. The ropes that had bound her slackened as those in the room ran to her. She tasted copper as her own blood flamed along her tongue and then retreated. The last sight she saw before her lids folded was of a door thrown wide and a shadow filling the frame. Caliph, unadorned by crown's illusion, his hair damp with war and possibly, from the look in his eyes, relief. He bent and gathered her in his arms, moving as if the world had simplified to the press of her body against his. She was light in his grasp, not inert, but emptied of the fight she had carried for weeks. "You were never meant to serve," he murmured into the curve of her neck, his voice breaking like a reed. "Only to save." She heard it as one hears the final lines of a song played at the wrong tempo, sad, lovely, true. Then darkness took her, soft as linen and as absolute as winter. When Mara woke, the sky had swollen into a wash of dawn that refused to be wicked. The battle had died into the kind of quiet that follows storms. Men patched wounds and counted losses, and in the hall of glass portraits seemed somehow less accusing. Caliph sat beside the bed where she slept, his hands bare and trembling. The curse was gone, and with it the old command that had bound his nights to hunger. He was, in the first fragile hours of his new mortality, a man who would have to learn the weight of living. Her wrist ached where the scar would be. Thea, when she saw him later, coughed less. Viral's plots crumbled into the rubble of what men will do when fate decides otherwise. Eldric's maps were filled with new lines that had not been drawn before. Their blood, mingled in a way neither had expected, had not destroyed them. It had undone what ages of terror had stitched in place. Mara had not been given the role of a sacrifice by others. She had chosen to be the instrument of an end. Her choice had not come without cost. The kingdom was forever altered. The memory of the bargains would not die easily, but in the rooms where the old portraits hung, faces softened. In the streets, bakers and smiths stepped into the light without immediate fear. And in a small bed beside a window that now let dawn through, two broken people leaned into the future, not as king and servant, not strictly as savior and saved, but something messier and truer. Caliph brushed the hair from her forehead and smiled, an expression that held awe and newness. "We will learn," he said, voice steadying like a newly tied knot. "Together." Mara squeezed his hand once, a small, ordinary gesture that felt enormous in the wake of what had been done. Outside, the morning bled into gold, and the city of Varnhelm, racked and relenting, began to breathe anew. Winter came softly that year. The kind of winter that didn't bite but hummed, quiet, slow, patient, as if the land itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. The banners of war had been taken down from Varnhelm's towers, and where once the air smelled of iron and smoke, it now carried the faint sweetness of thawing pine. The era of blood tribute was over. In the months since the last storm of crimson fell, The kingdom had learned to live without the old rituals. The temples shuttered their altars. The nobles unfastened their collars of silver. The common folk, those who had lived beneath the shadow of fear, found their nights a little less haunted. There were no more processions of royal daughters with their vials of trembling blood. No more priests chanting before the glass doors of the palace. Instead, the gates of Varnhelm stood open. Caliph, once the vampire king, the mourningless lord, walked among his people as a man whose steps were no longer followed by whispers. His immortality had melted away like frost, leaving only what centuries of silence had never allowed him: the ache and wonder of living as mortal flesh. His hair, once the color of moonlit ash, now carried streaks of warmth. The light of day touched his face without burning. The people bowed still, out of habit, but their eyes met his with something that had never existed before: kinship. He no longer ruled from a throne. He served instead as an advisor to the council that now governed the realm. His word was still weighty, but it was no longer law. Children followed him in the market streets, laughing as they mimicked his once feared stride. Sometimes he would stop and hand them the small wooden carvings he whittled in idle hours: birds, wolves, or little cups. He smiled more easily now, though some said the smile always carried a touch of sorrow, like a man who remembered too much of what he'd been. And yet, for all the kingdom's newfound light, there was one place where that light shone differently. Beyond the city walls, where the road curved toward the woods and the first crocuses broke through frost, stood a small inn with a red-painted door. Its sign, the Crimson Cup, swung gently in the breeze. The air around it smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and warm bread. Travelers came from distant provinces, drawn by rumor that the woman who ran the inn once changed the fate of kings. Inside, Mara Edivane moved with a quiet grace that was neither royal nor servile, simply human. She wore no jewels, no livery. Her sleeves were rolled, her fingers dusted with flour. Her scar, thin and pale now, traced her wrist like a faint whisper of history. The inn was small, but always full. Farmers shared tables with scholars, wanderers traded songs for supper. Mara served them all with a smile that was soft but knowing. In the evenings, she would sit near the hearth, watching the fires dance, and sometimes, only sometimes, she would reach for the empty chair across from her. Theo, her brother, had grown stronger. He ran errands for the nearby village, his laughter echoing through the hills like a promise fulfilled. Life had not become perfect, but it had become possible, and that was enough. On one particular night, when the first snow began to fall again, a traveler entered through the door. The inn went quiet not from fear, but from the strangeness that arrived with him. His cloak was weather-stained, his boots worn by long miles, and yet there was a stillness about him that bent the air. The candlelight caught on the edge of his profile, sharp, familiar, impossibly unchanged, and his eyes, when they lifted, gleamed silver. For a heartbeat, Mara forgot to breathe. He paused by the counter, gaze drifting over the shelves of steaming cups and jars of spice. Then, with a small, almost teasing smile, he said, "Do you still serve the king's brew?" It was the old phrase, the one he had once murmured in jest, when she spilled wine on his robes and blushed crimson. Mara's lips curved. She didn't answer right away. She reached instead for the pot over the hearth, poured a cup, and set it gently before him. Steam rose, carrying the scent of cinnamon and applewood. "Not anymore," she said finally. "But I serve something better, warmth." Caliph, or perhaps just the man who had once been him, accepted the cup with both hands. He blew lightly over it, the way mortals do to cool what burns, and took a sip. The silence that followed was neither heavy nor hollow. It was full, alive with all the things they no longer needed to say. Around them, the inn resumed its quiet noise. The scrape of chairs, the laughter of a child, the crackle of logs. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the earth in white. Mara sat across from him, her hands folded loosely, eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time in all his endless years, he did not see a savior, a curse, or a prophecy. He saw a woman who had once reached across an impossible distance and chosen him, not out of fear, but out of choice. And in that small, ordinary moment, something eternal stirred again, not the hunger that had once defined him, but the tender, living ache of love that was finally allowed to exist. The flames shifted, dawn began to pale the horizon. As light crept through the frost-blurred windows, Mara leaned back and smiled, a quiet, steady smile that belonged not to legend, but to life. Outside, the snow melted into gold. The world turned, soft and bright, as if relearning how to begin. And inside the crimson cup, a waitress and a king sat side by side, no throne, no crown, no curse, only warmth shared between two souls who had finally chosen peace. The prophecy fulfilled not through blood, but through love freely given.